Four-legged loyalty is not only a place to tell touching stories about dogs, but also a small corner to honor the loyalty of four-legged friends, creatures that have overcome all limits of strength and instinct to protect, accompany, and sometimes save people in the most extreme circumstances. These stories are not products of imagination or embellished details to impress. They are slices of real life, taken from real experiences, real people, and dogs that have left an indelible mark on people's hearts. Today, four-legged loyalty brings a story that takes place in the arid desert of Kandahar province, Afghanistan, a place where the scorching heat, blinding dust, and lurking dangers have tested the loyalty of a German shepherd named Kaiser and his companion, Corporal Ethan Brooks. This is the German shepherd and the lost soldier, a loyal journey beyond limits, a story of friendship, loyalty, and survival on the edge of life and death. Ethan Brooks, 25, is a corporal in the U.S. Army, stationed at a small base in Kandahar, about 300 miles south of Kabul. He's not a standout among the hundreds of soldiers on the base 5 feet 7 inches, a sturdy but not overly muscular man, with jet black hair cropped short in a military style and deep brown eyes that always wear a thoughtful expression as if hiding thoughts he rarely shares. His face is tanned by the intense desert heat, with sharp features and a small scar on his left cheek, the mark of a flying rock that hit him during a training exercise in Texas. Ethan was from Lubbock, a small town in West Texas where the white cotton fields stretched out endlessly under the blazing sun and red dust storms blew through every summer, covering everything in a fine layer of dust. His family was not wealthy, living in an old prefab house with a faded tin roof, where his father, Henry Brooks, worked as a tractor mechanic, and his mother, Margaret, worked at the local grocery store, selling packs of gum and cans of soda to passers-by. Ethan was the youngest of 3 children. His older brother, Caleb, had left Lubbock to work at an oil refinery in Oklahoma, while his older sister, Lily, had married a farmer in a nearby town, had 2 children, and lived a modest life. When Ethan was 20, his father died of a sudden heart attack, leaving the family in dire straits. Henry was a man of few words, but he taught Ethan that life was about perseverance, that even when the ground was dry and the sky was rainless, one had to find a way to survive. When he died, Ethan sat in the small living room of their prefab home, looking at a family photo on the wall, a picture taken the summer he was 10, the family standing in a cotton field in the golden sunshine, and felt an indescribable emptiness. He didn't want to live the same life his father had, fixing tractors day after day, dying with nothing but an old truck and a few rusty tools. One afternoon, while jogging through the cotton fields, he saw a recruiting poster at a gas station: "Join the Army, live for something bigger." The words struck a chord in him, and 2 months later, he packed his father's old duffel bag, a silvery gray one frayed at the strap, and headed to the recruiting center in Amarillo. When he arrived in Kandahar in 2021, Ethan was assigned to a patrol unit, a dangerous job that required vigilance and endurance in the harsh desert conditions. He wasn't the best soldier on the team, he wasn't as agile as some of his comrades, nor did he have the brilliance of a sharpshooter to call his own. But Ethan had one thing no one could deny: patience. He could walk for hours on dusty roads in 100-degree heat without complaining, and he could sit still on cold desert nights observing without losing focus. He carried his father's small folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of his days in Lubbock. He didn't talk much to his comrades, often sitting alone in his tent, reading an old book like Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises or jotting down random thoughts in a small notebook. "It was hot as hell today, but I still managed to walk 10 kilometers, or how is mom?" Kaiser came into Ethan's life one afternoon in March 2022, when he had been in Kandahar for almost a year. Kaiser was a German shepherd transferred from a training center in Germany, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Kaiser was not the largest of his litter, weighing about 70 pounds and standing nearly 26 inches from paw to shoulder, but he stood out for his intelligence and discipline. Kaiser's coat was thick and black-brown, groomed to withstand the desert heat and the gritty sand. Its ears were always erect, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the base's mud walls to the distant hum of a Humvee. Its bright brown eyes gleamed with a sharp, steady gaze, as if it always knew exactly what it needed to do. Kaiser was trained to detect landmines, a dangerous but necessary job in Afghanistan, where landmines left over from years of war could claim lives at any moment. The first time Ethan met Kaiser, he was standing in the base's training yard, under the hot afternoon sun. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by high mud walls and stacked sandbags, with dry ground and scattered rocks. Kaiser was led from his cage by a trainer named Alex, a man in his 40s with short brown hair and hands tanned from years of working in the desert. Alex wore a sand-color military shirt, put a black nylon collar on Kaiser's neck, and told Ethan that Kaiser was a good dog but difficult, not easy to accept strangers. Ethan looked at Kaiser, feeling the wariness in his eyes. He did not rush. He walked slowly, knelt down in front of Kaiser, about a meter away, and placed his hand on its head. Ethan's hand trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because he felt a strange connection. Kaiser sniffed his hand, tilted his head, then suddenly sat down, his eyes looking straight at Ethan as if accepting him from that moment. Alex laughed loudly, patted Ethan on the shoulder, and said that he was chosen by Kaiser. From then on, Ethan and Kaiser became an inseparable pair. Every morning, when the dawn just broke over the barren hills surrounding the base, Ethan took Kaiser on a patrol around the area, checking the dusty roads leading into the base. He would throw an old rubber ball, a frayed, sandy ball, for Kaiser to chase, watching him run with powerful strides, his muscles defined under his fur. Some days, when Ethan sat on a folding chair in the camp, reading or writing in a notebook, Kaiser would lie down next to him, his head resting on his forepaws, his eyes half closed but alert. Ethan didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Kaiser: "You smelled great today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Kaiser understood them, but every time he spoke, Kaiser would raise his head and look at him with bright eyes as if to answer. To Ethan, Kaiser was more than a working dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he had lost since leaving Lubbock. There were nights when Ethan lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with mud walls, a folding bed, and an old wooden table. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembered afternoons spent in his father's workshop, listening to him hammering away at the tractor engine, or walking with his mother to the grocery store, the smell of fresh bread in the air. But every time he looked down at Kaiser, curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Kaiser was more than a dog. He was the reason Ethan kept going, the reason he believed there was something worth living for. The story Four-Legged Loyalty wants to tell today is not just about Ethan and Kaiser, but also about a harsh test that tested their loyalty. It took place on a July afternoon in 2023, when Ethan and Kaiser were on a patrol mission near an abandoned village in Kandahar. The mission seemed simple: check a road suspected of being mined to ensure the safety of a supply convoy. But an unexpected explosion left Ethan missing, and Kaiser, with unwavering loyalty, stayed behind to save him. This is not a fictional story. It is told from military reports, from the accounts of those in the rescue team, and from Ethan's own scribbles in his notebook after he recovered. This is the German Shepherd and the missing soldier, a loyalty beyond limits. Ethan Brooks isn't a big talker, and if someone asks him where he's from or why he joined the military, he'll usually say, "Texas." Wanted to try something different. But behind that reticence lies a long story about growing up in Lubbock, a small town in the arid plains of West Texas, where life seems to revolve around white cotton fields, red dirt roads dusted in the summer, and dry winds blowing in from the highlands in the winter. Lubbock isn't a place where people dream big. It's a place where people live slowly, work hard, and rarely leave in search of a different life. Ethan grew up in a working-class family, neither rich nor poor. His father, Henry Brooks, was a tractor mechanic with rough oil-stained hands and jet black hair that had turned gray at the temples from years of hard labor. His mother, Margaret, was a gentle woman who worked at a small corner grocery store on the town's main street, where she stood behind the counter, selling packs of gum, cans of Coca-Cola, and packs of cigarettes to passers-by. Ethan was the youngest of 3 children. His older brother, Caleb, 5 years older, was a tall, dark-haired man with a lively personality who had left Lubbock when Ethan was 15 to work in an oil refinery in Oklahoma, sending money home each month to help support the family. His older sister, Lily, 3 years older, with her mother's blue eyes and sun-bleached blonde hair, had married a farmer in a nearby town, had 2 children, and lived a quiet life in a small house by a wheat field. Ethan, with his short jet black hair and deep brown eyes, was unlike his siblings in that he spoke little, smiled little, and always wore a pensive expression, as if he were thinking about something he never revealed. He was not a star student at Lubbock High School, but he was persistent. He liked to run on the dirt roads around town, often alone, in an old gray t-shirt and scuffed sneakers, letting the summer heat burn his skin and the red dust cling to his clothes. He didn't talk much to his friends, didn't attend the parties or the weekend football games that Lubbock kids loved. He just ran, thought, and searched for some meaning in his life that he couldn't quite figure out. When Ethan was 20, his father died of a sudden heart attack. Henry had collapsed in his workshop in the middle of a cold winter afternoon while trying to fix an old tractor for a local farmer. Ethan was the one who found his father, lying motionless on the dirt floor, his hands still clutching a wrench, his eyes wide open, staring up at the ceiling as if he were trying to say something last. Ethan didn't cry at the funeral. He stood silently by the coffin, watching his mother, Margaret, hug Lily and sob, while Caleb put his hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him with words he couldn't quite hear. After his father's death, the family fell on hard times. Margaret tried to make ends meet with the small amount of insurance money she had, but her job at the grocery store wasn't enough to make ends meet. Ethan started working part-time at a local gas station behind the counter, selling cans of beer and packs of cigarettes, but he hated feeling trapped in a repetitive life, a life where he felt like his father, working himself to the bone and leaving behind nothing but a few old mementos. Ethan didn't want to live like that. He remembered the afternoons he spent in the shop with his father, listening to him talk about his younger days, when he had dreamed of leaving Lubbock to work on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, but had stayed for family, for duty. Ethan didn't blame his father, but he didn't want to repeat that path. One day, while jogging through the cotton fields, he stopped at a gas station and saw a recruitment poster hanging on the wall: "Join the Army. Live for something bigger." The words were like a light bulb in his mind, awakening a desire he had long suppressed. 2 months later, he packed his father's old duffel bag, a silvery gray bag frayed at the straps, containing a few changes of clothes, his father's small folding knife, and a family photo taken in a cotton field, and set off for the recruiting center in Amarillo. He didn't say much when he left his mother. He just hugged her, felt her thin arms shaking on his shoulders, and boarded the bus without looking back. When he arrived in Kandahar in 2021, Ethan was assigned to a patrol unit at a small base about 20 kilometers west of Kandahar city. The base was an area surrounded by high earthen walls and sandbags, with tin-roofed huts and dry dirt roads crisscrossing it. He wore a sand-colored uniform, hard hat, and carried an M4 rifle, but he was not the most outstanding soldier on the team. He was not as agile as some of his comrades, nor did he have the outstanding shooting skills to be praised. But Ethan had one thing that no one could deny: patience. He could walk for hours on dusty roads in 104-degree heat without complaining, and he could sit still on cold desert nights to observe without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of Lubbock, of the days he thought he would never escape. Kaiser came into Ethan's life one afternoon in March 2022, when he had been in Kandahar for almost a year. Kaiser was a German shepherd transferred from a training center in Germany, where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Kaiser was not the largest of his litter, weighing about 70 pounds and standing nearly 26 inches from paw to shoulder, but he stood out for his intelligence and discipline. Kaiser's coat was thick and black and brown, groomed to withstand the desert heat and the gritty sand. His ears were always upright, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the base's mud walls to the distant hum of a Humvee. His bright brown eyes were sharp and determined, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Kaiser was trained to detect landmines, a dangerous but necessary job in Afghanistan, where landmines left over from years of war could claim lives at any moment. The first time Ethan met Kaiser, he was standing in the base's training yard, under the harsh afternoon sun. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by high earthen walls and stacked sandbags, with dry ground and scattered rocks. Kaiser was led from his kennel by a trainer named Alex, a man in his 40s with short brown hair and hands tanned from years of working in the desert. Alex wore a sand-colored military shirt, put a black nylon collar around Kaiser's neck, and told Ethan that Kaiser was a good dog but a difficult one, not easily accepting of strangers. Ethan looked at Kaiser, sensing the wariness in his eyes. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, kneeling down in front of Kaiser about a meter away, and placed his hand on its head. Ethan's hand trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because he felt a strange connection. Kaiser sniffed his hand, tilted his head, then suddenly sat down, his eyes looking straight at Ethan as if accepting him from that moment. Alex laughed loudly, patted Ethan on the shoulder, and said that he had been chosen by Kaiser. From then on, Ethan and Kaiser became an inseparable pair. Every morning, as dawn broke over the dry hills surrounding the base, Ethan took Kaiser on a patrol around the area, checking the dusty roads leading into the base. He would throw an old rubber ball, a worn and sandy ball, for Kaiser to chase, watching it run with strong steps, its muscles clearly visible under its fur. Some days, when Ethan sat in a folding chair in the camp, reading or writing in a notebook, Kaiser would lie down next to him, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Ethan didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Kaiser: "You smell really good today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Kaiser understood what he said, but every time he spoke, Kaiser would raise his head and look at him with bright eyes, as if to respond. To Ethan, Kaiser was more than a working dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he'd lost since leaving Lubbock. There were nights when Ethan lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with mud walls, a folding bed, and an old wooden table. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembered afternoons in his father's workshop, listening to him hammering away at the tractor engine, or walking with his mother to the grocery store, the smell of fresh bread in the air. But every time he looked down at Kaiser, curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Kaiser was more than a dog. He was Ethan's motivation to keep going, to believe that life was still worth living. One afternoon in July 2023, Ethan Brooks and Kaiser were on a patrol near an abandoned village in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, about 15 kilometers east of their small military base. The mission was not unusual for Ethan's patrol unit. They were regularly sent out to check roads for potential mines, ensuring the safety of supply convoys carrying food, water, and ammunition from the main base in Kandahar city to outlying outposts. But as Ethan stood in the base yard that day, watching the Humvees lined up in preparation for departure, he felt a vague unease creep up on him. Perhaps it was the scorching heat of the summer afternoon, when the temperature outside had climbed into the 100s, and the dry air made his skin feel as if it were on fire. Or perhaps it was the look in Kaiser's eyes, his German shepherd who always walked beside him. As he lifted his head to look at him, his ears pricked as if sensing something he couldn't see. Ethan wore a sand-colored uniform designed to blend into the desert landscape, with a lightweight sun-protective jacket, sandproof pants, and brown leather boots dusted with dust from previous patrols. He wore a sand-colored hard hat, the brim frayed from sweat and dirt, and military sunglasses to protect his eyes from the harsh sunlight and sudden gusts of sand. Over his shoulder, he carried a small backpack containing the essentials: a scratched plastic water bottle, a pack of dry rations, a small first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic, and the notebook he kept with him, where he jotted down his scattered thoughts about life in Kandahar. At his side was an M4 rifle, the sling frayed at the edges. But he was not a soldier who relied on weapons. He relied more on his vigilance and observation than on bullets. Ethan was not a showman. He did not carry the fancy gadgets or luxuries of some of his comrades, who favored GPS watches or noise-canceling headphones, because for him, simplicity was the way to keep his mind focused. Kaiser, as always, walked beside Ethan. The 75-pound German shepherd had thick, well-groomed black-brown fur to protect against the desert heat and the gritty sand. Kaiser wore a black nylon collar with a small metal tag bearing his military identification number, K9182. Kaiser's ears were erect, his bright brown eyes were alert, and his steps were strong and sure as he walked across the dry ground of the base yard. Ethan looked at Kaiser, feeling a strange sense of comfort. He knew that Kaiser was more than just a working dog. He was a companion he could count on in any situation, especially in a place like Kandahar, where every step could be a brush with death. Before getting into the car, Ethan knelt down and stroked Kaiser's head, feeling the dry but soft fur under his hand, sandy from previous patrols. He didn't think much of it, but deep down, he felt that having Kaiser by his side was enough to face whatever was coming. Ethan's patrol consisted of 6 men, all experienced soldiers, trained to face the dangers of a war zone. The team leader was Sergeant John Carter, a 35-year-old man with sun-bleached blonde hair, a sharp face tanned by time in the desert, and sharp blue eyes that watched everything with caution. Carter was stern but fair, always putting the safety of the team first, and he had a leadership style that made people trust him, even though he was sometimes quiet to the point of being cold. The other members of the team included Private First Class Miguel Lopez, a short, stocky man of about 27, with short black hair and a cheerful disposition, who always carried a lighter engraved with his family name, Corporal Aisha Khan, a petite but agile 29-year-old woman who was good at reading maps and navigating, and 3 other soldiers with whom Ethan was not particularly close, but who he knew could be trusted in an emergency. The team was well-equipped: paper maps, handheld mine detectors, walkie-talkies, flashlights, and some survival supplies like water, rations, and a small tent for use in case they had to stay overnight. The trip began around 2 p.m., as the sun was at its peak, sending scorching heat waves down from the ground. The team traveled in 2 military Humvees, sand-colored vehicles with large tires designed to handle the rugged desert terrain. Ethan sat in the back seat of the second vehicle, next to Aisha, while Kaiser curled up at his feet, his head resting on his forepaws, his ears perked up as the road creaked. The road from the base to the abandoned village was a long one, passing through dry fields of low-growing bushes, across low sand dunes dotted with rocks worn by centuries of wind, and through dirt roads muddy from the last few rains. Ethan looked out the window, watching the small columns of dust swirl up from the ground whenever the wind blew, and his unease grew more pronounced. He didn't know why he felt that way, but he tried to push it aside, telling himself that this was just a routine patrol. When the team reached the starting point of the mission, an open area about 2 kilometers from the abandoned village, they got out of the vehicle and began to prepare. Their mission was to check a 5 km long road leading through the village, a road that was suspected to be mined due to reports from other units of unusual rebel activity in the area. Carter stood in front of the team, map in hand, and explained the plan. "We'll walk this road, checking each section with a mine detector. Kaiser will go ahead to detect anything suspicious. If there's any sign of an ambush, retreat to the vehicle immediately. The weather is hot today, but there's no sign of strong winds. Stay hydrated and focused." Ethan listened, nodding, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety in his heart. He looked down at Kaiser, who stood still, his ears pricked higher, as if sniffing the dry desert air. The team set out around 2:30 p.m. Dry sand clung to Ethan's shoes as they left the clearing, and the heat caused sweat to run down his forehead, seep through the brim of his helmet, and drip into his eyes, forcing him to blink to see clearly. The temperature was now approaching 110 degrees, and the ground was so hot he could feel the heat seeping through the soles of his shoes. Ethan walked near the front of the team, with Kaiser as usual. He walked at a steady pace, his boots leaving faint footprints in the dry sand, quickly blown away by the wind. Kaiser walked beside him, his nose constantly sniffing the ground, his eyes alert, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air as if searching for something. The team moved in silence, the only sounds being their footsteps and their heavy breathing in the intense heat. Ethan could feel sweat seeping through his uniform, sticking it to his back, but he didn't complain. He was used to patrols like this, and he knew it was part of the job. As the team approached the abandoned village, the landscape became more desolate. The road leading into the village was a narrow path, lined with the ruined mud walls of houses destroyed in the war, with broken bricks and charred wood strewn across the ground. The low mud walls, about 5 feet high, stood like ghosts of the past, and the gaps between them revealed dry sand fields stretching to the horizon. Ethan looked up at the sky, saw the sun shining unobstructed, and the heat waves vibrating from the ground like a mirage. He turned to look at Kaiser, saw the dog pause for a moment, his head raised, ears pricked higher, his nose sniffing the dry air. He thought to himself that Kaiser must have sensed something was wrong, but he wasn't sure what it was. At around 3 p.m., when the team had covered nearly 2 kilometers, they entered a narrow alley between 2 ruined earthen walls. The alley was less than 3 meters wide, with the ground covered in dry sand and scattered pieces of stone. Ethan felt the heat intensify, as if the air was trapped between the walls, with no breeze to cool it. He looked at Kaiser, who was more focused than ever, his nose sniffing the ground, his ears pricked to the max. He felt a greater unease than ever, but he didn't have time to think about it. Little did he know that, in a few minutes, an explosion would occur, and his life would change forever. As Ethan Brooks's patrol pushed deeper into the narrow alley between the crumbling mud walls of an abandoned village in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, the heat of the July afternoon became oppressive. The temperature was well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dry air trapped between the low 5-foot-high mud walls created an invisible furnace that burned everything inside. The ground beneath Ethan's feet was hot, penetrating the soles of his brown leather boots, making him feel as if he were walking on hot coals. Sweat ran down his forehead, seeped through the frayed brim of his sand-colored hard hat, and into his eyes, forcing him to blink. His sand-colored uniform, a lightweight sun jacket and sand pants, clung to his skin with sweat, and dry dust clung to his shoulders and chest, leaving pale brown streaks. He carried his M4 rifle over his shoulder, the frayed straps rubbing against his neck as he walked, but he didn't care. His unease was greater than any discomfort from the heat or the dirt. Ethan walked near the front of the team, with Kaiser, his trusty German shepherd. Kaiser walked with sure steps, his thick black-brown fur matted with fine sand from the ground, but his erect ears and bright brown eyes still gleamed with constant alertness. Kaiser's black nylon collar, with its metal tag bearing the number K9182, vibrated slightly as he moved, and his nose sniffed the ground constantly, searching for any sign of danger. Ethan looked at Kaiser, feeling a small comfort amid the heat and the growing tension in his heart. He knew that Kaiser was more than just a working dog. It was his second set of eyes and ears, a creature that could detect things that humans could not. But even the presence of Kaiser could not completely dispel the unease he had carried with him since leaving the base, a feeling that something was waiting for them ahead, hidden beneath the dry sand and crumbling earthen walls. The patrol had traveled about 2 kilometers since leaving the clearing, and the narrow alley they were entering was a path less than 3 m wide, with the ground covered in dry sand and scattered pieces of stone, the remains of houses that had stood before the war. On both sides of the alley were low earthen walls, standing precariously like ghosts of the past, with broken bricks and charred wood strewn across the ground. The small space made Ethan feel claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in around him, and the heat rising from the ground made it hard to breathe. He looked up at the sky, only to see the bright sun shining without any cover, shining down with white rays that made his eyes hurt even with his sunglasses. He turned to look at Kaiser, saw the dog stop for a moment, raised its head to sniff the air, ears perked up higher, as detecting something unusual. Ethan felt his heart beat faster, but he didn't have time to think further. Just a few seconds later, when the team advanced a few meters into the alley, there was a sudden explosion. A mine hidden under the sand exploded about 5 meters in front of Ethan, creating an ear-splitting explosion that shook the ground violently. A cloud of dust flew up, carrying dry sand and pieces of rubble, momentarily blocking the team's vision. The force of the explosion threw Ethan back, and he fell into a deep hole beside the road, an old pit from earlier battles, covered over by years of sand and dirt, now suddenly exposed as the sand above collapsed under the force of the blast. Ethan fell into the hole, about 4 meters deep, his body hitting the rocks and hard soil underneath. He felt a sharp pain in his left leg as it snapped under the weight of the fall, and his head hit a sharp rock, drawing blood from a gash in his forehead. He passed out instantly, his body motionless in the darkness of the hole, the small backpack on his shoulder torn off at one corner, and his M4 rifle falling out, lying a few meters away on the dry dirt. Kaiser, fortunately far from the epicenter of the blast, was unhurt, but the dog barked frantically as Ethan disappeared into the hole. Kaiser's bark echoed through the dust, full of panic and desperation, as if calling Ethan back. The dog ran to the edge of the hole, claws clawing at the hot, dry sand, trying to dig down to find him, but the soil was thick and hard, hardened by years of desert heat. Kaiser scratched and scratched, leaving deep scratches in the sand, but he couldn't penetrate. Kaiser's bright brown eyes were red from the dust and heat, and his black-brown fur was matted with fine sand, but he didn't care. In his mind, there was only one goal: finding Ethan. The patrol, cut off by the explosion, fell into disarray. The explosion not only shook the ground, but also alerted them to another danger. Sporadic gunfire rang out in the distance, about 200 meters east of the alley, a sign of an ambush by insurgents hiding in the area. Sergeant John Carter, the squad leader, stood about 10 meters from the explosion, his vision obscured by dust, but he quickly regained his composure. He shouted into his radio, his voice broken by the wind and gunfire. "Brooks, where are you? Report now." But there was no response. Ethan's radio, which was in his backpack, had been damaged when he fell, and the signal was lost. Carter turned around to find the other members of the squad, Miguel Lopez, Aisha Khan, and the 3 remaining soldiers, hunkering down behind the mud walls, clutching their rifles, keeping an eye out for any silhouettes that might emerge from the dust. Kaiser continued to bark, his bark echoing in the alley, but no one on the team could get close enough to investigate. The distant gunfire was getting closer, and Carter knew it was too dangerous to stay here. He ordered over the radio, "Get back to the car immediately. Call for backup." The team began to move back out of the alley, keeping a tight formation to avoid being ambushed, but Kaiser refused to follow. Miguel Lopez, the closest to Kaiser, ran up, grabbed the dog's nylon collar, and tried to pull him away. But Kaiser growled, yanked the leash, and ran back to the edge of the pit, barking incessantly. Carter looked at Kaiser, saw the dog's determined gaze, but he had no choice. He ordered the team to retreat without Kaiser, knowing they needed to survive to call for help. The team left the alley, leaving Kaiser alone in the dangerous terrain, with gunfire in the distance and dust still in the air. Ethan lay unconscious in the pit, his body shaking from the trauma, blood from the gash on his forehead running down his cheek, drying in red streaks on his tanned skin. He didn't know that the team had retreated, didn't know that gunfire was ringing above him, and didn't know that Kaiser was at the edge of the pit, determined not to leave. In the darkness of the pit, a small gap in the dirt left by the rare rains of the past allowed air to seep in, keeping him breathing, albeit feebly. His backpack lay scattered beside him, his notebook falling out, open to the last page he'd written. "Today was hot as hell, but I still managed to get 10 kilometers. He didn't have the strength to wake up, didn't have the strength to call out to Kaiser, but in his days he vaguely thought of the dog, hoping that Kaiser was safe with the team. Above ground, Kaiser didn't care about the gunfire or the scorching heat. It stood at the edge of the pit, claws scraping the dry sand, leaving deep scratches that it could not dig through. Its barks were getting weaker as the dust and heat dried its throat, but it did not stop. Kaiser knew Ethan was down there, and it would not leave until it found him. Dry sand clung to its fur, its eyes red with dust and fatigue, but its gaze was unwavering, as if to say it would never give up. Kaiser stood there, alone in the narrow alley, in the dangerous desert, waiting, against all odds, as a testament to its loyalty to Ethan, a loyalty that would lead to a journey beyond all limits in the days to come. After an explosion sent Ethan Brooks plummeting into a deep hole in a narrow alleyway in an abandoned village in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, the patrol was forced to retreat, leaving Kaiser, the loyal German shepherd, alone in the dangerous desert. The scorching heat of the July afternoon did not let up as the sun set in the west, still casting a white light with temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was dry, filled with fine sand dust that hung in the air, blurring vision and clinging to everything in the alleyway, from the 5-foot-tall crumbling earthen walls to the scattered pieces of stone. Kaiser stood at the edge of the hole where Ethan had disappeared, his ears erect, his bright brown eyes now red from the dust and heat, but his gaze never wavered. He barked incessantly, echoing off the earthen walls, weakened by his parched throat, but Kaiser did not care. In its mind, there was only one goal: to find Ethan, the companion it had chosen to be loyal to since the first day they met. 3 days had passed since the explosion, and Kaiser remained at the edge of the pit, despite the scorching heat of the day and the chill of the night, which dropped below 20 degrees Celsius and made its body shiver. The Kandahar desert was unforgiving to any living creature, and Kaiser had no water or food to sustain him. His thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed to protect against the dust, was now caked with fine sand, matted in dry patches, revealing the emaciated body beneath. His ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched from hitting the rocks during his relentless digging efforts. His bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were now red and dim from the dust, the heat, and exhaustion, but they still stared at the sand covering the pit, as if they could see through it to Ethan below. Kaiser clawed at the ground, leaving deep scratches in the dry sand, sometimes bleeding where his claws met the sharp rocks hidden beneath the surface. He tried to dig through more than a meter of dirt to reach Ethan, but the heat had hardened the sand like cement, and every time Kaiser dug a little, the wind blew new sand back in, erasing his efforts. Kaiser did not give up. He stopped, panting, his breath creating small clouds of dust in the dry air, then started scratching again, as if driven by some deep instinct, an instinct of absolute loyalty to Ethan. His legs trembled with heat and exhaustion. The lean muscles that had once propelled him along the dusty roads around the base now atrophied from lack of water and nourishment. Kaiser ate nothing but the few grains of dry sand he accidentally swallowed when he sniffed the ground, and he drank nothing but the rare moisture of the night air. Its red eyes stared into the sand, and its barks grew fainter by the day, drowned out by the howling wind through the alley and the sporadic gunfire in the distance, signs of the fighting that still smoldered in the area. But Kaiser didn't care about danger or impending death. He only knew that Ethan was down there, and he had to stay to save him. In the pit, Ethan lay in the suffocating darkness, his body immobile from the horrific fall from the explosion. He woke up after a day in a coma, his mind hazy, not knowing how long he had been there. The sharp pain from his broken left leg spread throughout his body, and every time he tried to move, he had to grit his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. A gash on his forehead, where he hit the rocks when he fell, left dried blood streaking his tanned face, and his brown eyes were blurred with dehydration and exhaustion. The temperature in the pit was slightly cooler than outside, around 35 degrees Celsius during the day, but the stuffy, oxygen-poor air made it difficult for him to breathe. He survived because of a small gap in the soil where outside air seeped in, carrying moisture from the rare rains of the past. He caught tiny drops of water from the damp soil with his hands, taking weak sips to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he knew that if he didn't get help soon, he wouldn't last much longer. In those dreamy hours, Ethan thought about Kaiser. He remembered the mornings at Kandahar, when he would throw an old rubber ball for Kaiser to chase in the training yard, watching the dog run with strong strides, his muscles defined by his sandy, black-brown fur. He remembered the nights in the camp when Kaiser would lie curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, his ears pricked as he whispered to him about his days in Lubbock. He remembered the way Kaiser's eyes would light up when he looked at him, as if the dog understood everything he was not saying. He wondered if Kaiser was safe, if he had followed the patrol to find shelter, or if he was still somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He didn't know that Kaiser was right above him, just a few meters away, but separated by a thick layer of dirt. He whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Kaiser, where are you? If you're still alive, come find me." But he didn't have the strength to scream, and his voice was drowned out by the oppressive silence of the pit. On the ground, Kaiser faced the heat, the dust, and the danger of sporadic gunfire in the distance. A few times, shadowy figures of rebels appeared on the edge of the village, about 300 meters from the alley, but they didn't come near, perhaps because they didn't recognize Kaiser as a lone dog. Kaiser didn't care about those dangers. He didn't think about hunger, thirst, or the heat that was slowly robbing him of his life. In his mind, there was only Ethan, the soldier who had knelt down and stroked his head when they first met, who had shared patrols under the scorching sun, who had become his family in this strange land. Kaiser lay down on the edge of the pit when the heat of the day became too much, curling up to keep some of his own warmth during the cold nights, but after a few minutes, he would stand up again, scratching and barking, as if not allowing himself to rest. About 5 kilometers away from the abandoned village, a group of local villagers living near a small oasis heard Kaiser's faint bark echoing in the distance through the sand winds. They were people accustomed to this desert, accustomed to the sound of gunfire and explosions of war, but the sound of a dog barking in the wilderness intrigued them. A man named Omar, about 50 years old, a goat herder in the area, stood on a low sand dune, listening to the distant barking, but he could not determine exactly where it was coming from. He thought it might be a stray dog, but he did not dare go near the village area, where occasional gunfire still rang out and stories of unexploded mines frightened the locals. He returned to his tent and sat by the small fire, but he still felt a vague unease. He did not know that the barking belonged to Kaiser, a dog fighting heat, thirst, and death to save his master. Down in the pit, Ethan began to lose consciousness. He felt his body growing lighter, as if he were floating in an unknown space. He no longer felt the pain of his broken leg or the stifling heat. Everything became blurry, and his mind drifted to distant memories. He remembered afternoons jogging on the dirt roads of Lubbock when the summer sun shone through the cotton fields, making them glow like white clouds on the ground. He remembered sitting in the workshop with his father, listening to him hammering on the tractor engine, the smell of engine oil in the air. He remembered mornings in Kandahar, when he and Kaiser patrolled the base, the peace of watching the dog run along the dusty roads. He thought that if he had to die here, at least he would have had those moments when he felt his life had meaning. But he didn't want to give up. He whispered in his heart, "Kaiser, if you're still there, find me. I believe in you." On the ground, Kaiser didn't know that Ethan was losing hope. He didn't know that the patrol had retreated, that the sound of gunfire was still ringing in the distance, that no one heard his barking in the desert wasteland. But Kaiser didn't need to know that. He didn't act on reason or logic. He acted on instinct, on the loyalty that was deep in the heart of a German shepherd. Kaiser stood there in the narrow alley, a lone figure in the sea of dry sand, steadfast and unyielding. He didn't leave, didn't give up, even though his body was exhausted, even though the heat and dust were slowly taking away his vitality. Kaiser knew that Ethan was down there, and he would stay until he found him, or until he no longer had the strength to continue. 3 days passed, and Kaiser still stood there, living testament to loyalty that transcended all limits. He didn't know that the rescue team from the base would soon return, that his efforts would lead them to Ethan. But Kaiser didn't need to know that. To him, only one thing mattered. Ethan, his companion, his master, the one he had chosen to be loyal to since the day they first met. There, in the desert of Kandahar, stood Kaiser, waiting, hoping, and fighting, a German shepherd with a heart that would never give up. 3 days after an explosion sent Ethan Brooks plummeting into a deep crater in a narrow alleyway in an abandoned village in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, the scorching desert heat continued unabated. Daytime temperatures hovered around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dry earth shook with waves of heat, making the air stifling and hazy with fine floating sand. Ethan lay at the bottom of the crater in the stifling darkness, his body immobile from his horrific fall. He had awoken from a day in a coma, but now he was drifting into a dreamlike state between life and death. The pain from his broken left leg and the gash on his forehead was now a dull ache, as if his body had given up on the pain. He had stopped sweating because he was severely dehydrated, and his brown eyes were blurry and half-closed in the darkness. His breathing was weak, coming in thin wisps that dissipated in the dry air, and he had no strength to move or call for help. He survived by a small gap in the earth where the outside air seeped in, carrying moisture from the rare rains of the past, but he knew his time was running out. On the ground, Kaiser still stood at the edge of the hole, a lone figure in the dangerous desert. 3 days had passed, and the 75-pound German shepherd was now emaciated and exhausted, his thick black-brown fur matted with fine sand, matted in dry clumps. Kaiser's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes were now red from dust, heat, and fatigue. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches where he had scratched the dry sand for 3 days without stopping. Kaiser had no water, no food, only his thick fur to protect him from the heat of the day and the cold of the night, but he did not care for himself. It barked incessantly, its barks growing fainter as the day wore on, drowned out by the wind whistling through the alley and the occasional gunshot in the distance, but Kaiser did not give up. He knew Ethan was down there, and he would not leave until he found him. After 3 days, when the rebel ambush in the area had been repelled, the rescue team from the small military base in Kandahar decided to return to the abandoned village. They had not acted sooner because the danger of gunfire and the presence of rebels had made all previous rescue attempts impossible. But when the situation stabilized, Sergeant John Carter, Ethan's patrol leader, resolutely led the rescue team back. Carter, a 35-year-old man with sun-bleached blonde hair, a tanned, angular face, and piercing blue eyes, could not forget the unwavering look in Kaiser's eyes when the dog had refused to leave the alley 3 days earlier. He knew that if Ethan was alive, Kaiser would be the key to finding him. The rescue team, consisting of 10 people, was equipped with 2 Humvees, handheld mine detectors, high-powered headlights, digging tools like shovels and hose, and a medical kit for emergency first aid. They left the base early on the morning of the 4th day, when the temperature was still 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was just rising over the dry sand dunes, casting a pale yellow light through the fine dust in the air. When the rescue team reached the abandoned village, they saw Kaiser in the distance, a small but resilient figure in the narrow alley. Kaiser stood there, almost motionless, his legs shaking with exhaustion, his fur matted with sand, and a trail of dried blood running from his paws into the sand below. Carter, the leader of the team, stopped and looked at Kaiser with amazement and emotion. He couldn't believe that the dog had stayed here for 3 days, in the scorching heat and danger from the rebels, without water or food. He walked closer, knelt down before Kaiser, and noticed that the dog's red eyes were still shining steadfastly, as if pleading with him. "Ethan is here. Help me." Kaiser no longer had the strength to bark loudly, only making weak, hoarse sounds, then dragged himself to the edge of the hole, scratching the ground with his bloody claws as if to show the rescue team where to dig. Corporal Aisha Khan, a patrolman and now part of the rescue team, stood next to Carter, looking at Kaiser with tears in her eyes. Aisha, a petite but agile 29-year-old with dark hair tied back and tanned skin, had worked with Ethan and Kaiser on many patrols. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a pang of pain at the thought that Ethan might not make it. But seeing Kaiser gave her a glimmer of hope. She walked over, knelt down beside Kaiser, and stroked his sandy fur. She felt his thin, shaking body under her hands, and she knew that Kaiser had sacrificed everything to stay here, waiting for Ethan. "If he's alive," she whispered to herself, "it's because of you, Kaiser." The rescue team quickly got into position. They carried long steel shovels, iron picks, and a handheld sandblaster to break up the 3-foot-thick layer of earth that covered the entrance to the pit. Kaiser, exhausted, trudged closer to the edge, clawing at the ground with his feeble claws, as if to help. Carter ordered the team to concentrate on digging in the area Kaiser had indicated, where the sand was deeply scratched by the dog's claws. He knew Kaiser wasn't there for nothing. If Ethan was alive, he would be down there. The rescuers worked in silence, the only sounds being the shovels digging into the sand, the picks breaking the ground, and their labored breathing in the intense heat. Kaiser stood by, his legs shaking, but he didn't move. He looked at the rescuers with a steady gaze, as if pleading with them, "Hurry. He needs us." Ethan didn't know the rescuers had arrived down in the pit. He had lost track of time, and his body was in critical condition. The temperature in the pit was about 35 degrees Celsius, lower than outside, but the stuffy air and lack of oxygen left him with only weak breaths. He caught tiny drops of water from the moist soil through the cracks, drinking sips to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength to eat or move. His backpack, torn apart when he fell, lay scattered beside him, and his notebook fell out, open to the last page where he had written, "Today is hot as hell, but I still managed to walk 10 kilometers. He had no strength to hold a pin, but in his heart he thought of Kaiser, of the dog's bright eyes every time he looked at him, and told himself that if Kaiser were still alive, he would not abandon him. He did not know that Kaiser was right above him, leading the rescue team to save him. The rescue team worked tirelessly for more than an hour under the blazing sun. They dug through the dry sand, breaking up the hard dirt, and finally found a narrow opening leading down into the pit. Carter bent down, shining a powerful flashlight inside, and the light from the flashlight illuminated Ethan's pale face. He lay there, motionless, eyes half closed, breathing so weak he could barely see, with dried blood on his forehead and his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Carter felt his heart sink, but he did not give up hope. "We found him." "Hurry," he shouted to the team. "Hurry." The rescuers quickly widened the entrance, using shovels and their bare hands to clear the sand, creating a path large enough to pull Ethan up. Kaiser, exhausted, trudged closer, looking down into the opening with a bright gaze. He had no strength left to bark, but he stood there waiting as if he knew Ethan was about to be rescued. Aisha and a paramedic named David, a man in his mid-30s with short brown hair and strong arms, climbed down into the pit to check on Ethan. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and checked his pulse and breathing. David placed his hand on Ethan's neck, felt a faint pulse, and confirmed that he was alive, though in critical condition. "He's alive, but very weak," he told Aisha. "We need to get him out now." They carefully placed Ethan on a stretcher, strapping him in place to avoid further injury. When Ethan was pulled to the surface, the bright sunlight illuminated his pale face, and the rescuers breathed a sigh of relief. He was alive, a miracle after 3 days trapped in the pit in the desert heat. Kaiser shuffled over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Ethan's face, his red eyes shining faintly but hopefully. Kaiser had no strength left to do anything more, but he was still there, next to Ethan, as if to make sure he was still alive. Carter looked at Kaiser with admiration and emotion. He knelt down beside the dog, stroking its sandy fur, feeling its trembling body under his hands. He knew that without Kaiser, they would never have found Ethan in time. He whispered to himself, "You are a true warrior, Kaiser." Aisha wiped the dust from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Kaiser, saw his emaciated body, his shaking legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Ethan. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Kaiser. You did the unthinkable." The rescue team quickly treated Ethan on the spot. David administered fluids through and for, pumping cool saline solution to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken left leg and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left leg to temporarily immobilize him, and wrapped a thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the heat. Ethan was still unconscious, but his breathing was gradually steadier, and his pulse was becoming more noticeable. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Ethan into an armored vehicle to move back to base, Kaiser trailed behind, never leaving Ethan's side. The dog was so exhausted that he could barely walk, but he tried, his legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the sand. Aisha looked at Kaiser, feeling a pang of pain in her heart. She knew Kaiser needed medical attention, but she also knew that he wouldn't leave Ethan until he was sure he was safe. Carter ordered the team, "Take Kaiser with you. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Kaiser had done his job, not with strength or skill, but with loyalty beyond measure. 3 days after an explosion sent Ethan Brooks plummeting into a deep hole in the narrow alleys of an abandoned village in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, a rescue team from a small military base returned with the faintest hope that he was still alive. The scorching desert heat continued unabated, with daytime temperatures hovering around 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the parched earth shook with heat waves, making the air stifling and hazy with fine, floating sand. The rescue team, a team of 10 men equipped with Humvees, mine detectors, and digging tools, worked tirelessly for more than 2 hours to break through the thick layer of earth that covered the entrance to the hole where Ethan was trapped. The sun hung high in a cloudless sky, casting a white light that stung their eyes, even though they were all wearing protective military-grade sunglasses. The team's long steel shovels and iron picks dug deep into the dry sand, making dry sounds that echoed in the narrow alley, where the 1.5-meter-high rubble of earthen walls stood like ghosts of the past. Kaiser, the German shepherd who had been guarding the edge of the pit for 3 days, was now exhausted, his thin body shivering in the intense heat. His thick black-brown fur was covered with fine sand, matted in dry patches, revealing the prominent veins on his once muscular body. Kaiser's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes were now red from the dust, the heat, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, his claws bleeding from deep scratches from scratching the dry sand for 3 days without stopping, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Kaiser stood there, almost motionless, but his eyes never left the rescue team, as if waiting for a miracle. It had no strength left to bark, only a weak, hoarse sound, but it still trudged closer to the edge of the hole, clawing at the ground as if to help, though each movement was an effort beyond its physical limits. Sergeant John Carter, the rescue team leader, stood near Kaiser, watching the team work with a mixture of tension and hope. Carter, a 35-year-old man with sun-bleached blonde hair, a rugged face tanned by long periods in the desert, and piercing blue eyes, had seen much loss during his years in Afghanistan. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Kaiser standing guard for 3 days without food or water, in the heat and at risk from insurgents, had filled him with a deep respect. He looked down at the dog, saw its trembling body beneath its sandy fur, and thought to himself, "If he lives, you'll be a hero, Kaiser." But he didn't dare hope for too much. 3 days in the pit in the desert heat was an ordeal few could endure, even for a soldier as tough as Ethan. In the pit, Ethan lay in the suffocating darkness, his body almost motionless, his breathing so weak it was almost inaudible. He had lost track of time, and the heat of about 35 degrees Celsius in the pit, though cooler than outside, was still draining him. The pain from his broken left leg and the gash on his forehead were now just vague sensations, as if his body had become numb to the pain. Sweat no longer flowed because he was severely dehydrated, and his brown eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. He survived because of a small gap in the soil where air from the outside seeped in, carrying a little moisture from the rare rains of the past. He caught tiny drops of water from the damp soil, drinking weakly to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength left to eat or move. In his daze, he thought of Kaiser, remembered the dog's glowing eyes whenever he looked at him, and whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Kaiser, if you're still there, find me." But he didn't have the strength to hope for much more. On the ground, the rescue team finally broke through the thick layer of dirt covering the entrance to the pit after more than 2 hours of nonstop work. Sweat streamed down their faces, seeping through their sand-colored uniforms, and dust covered their hands and shoulders, but no one complained. They widened the narrow opening into an entrance large enough for one person to climb down, and Carter bent down, shining a powerful flashlight inside. The light from the flashlight fell on Ethan's pale face, highlighting the dried blood on his forehead and his dry, cracked lips. He lay there, motionless, eyes half closed, breathing so weak he could barely see, with his left leg bent at an awkward angle and his right arm hanging limply in the dry dirt. Carter felt his heart sink. He wasn't sure if Ethan was still alive, but he wasn't giving up. He shouted to the team, "We found him. Hurry!" The rescue team quickly got into position, preparing to lift Ethan to the surface. Corporal Aisha Khan and Medic David, a man in his mid-30s with short brown hair and strong arms, volunteered to climb down the hole to check on Ethan. Aisha climbed down first, her hands shaking from the heat as she clung to the slippery, dry dirt in the hole. She knelt down next to Ethan, placing her hand on his neck to check his pulse. His pulse was weak, but still beating, a fragile sign of life. She felt a glimmer of hope, but she also knew that Ethan was in dire straits. She looked at his pale face, saw his dry lips and half-closed eyes, and felt a pang of pain. She had patrolled with Ethan before, knew him to be a patient soldier who kept his cool in difficult situations, and she whispered to herself, "You have to live, Ethan. The Kaiser didn't abandon you, and neither will we." David, who climbed down after Aisha, carried a thermal blanket and a small medical kit. He checked Ethan's breathing, placed his hand on his chest to feel for him, and confirmed that he was alive though weak. "He's severely dehydrated," he told Aisha, "and his leg is badly broken. We need to get him out now." Aisha and David carefully placed Ethan on a stretcher, strapping him in with straps to avoid further damage to his injuries. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, trying to protect his body from the heat while the rescue team above pulled the stretcher up. When Ethan was pulled to the surface, the bright sunlight shone on his pale face, highlighting the dried blood and cracked skin from dehydration. The rescue team breathed a sigh of relief to see him alive, a miracle after 3 days trapped in the pit in the desert heat. Kaiser, exhausted, trudged over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Ethan's face. The dog's red eyes lit up faintly, but hopefully, as if he knew Ethan had been saved. Kaiser no longer had the strength to bark, but he put his head on Ethan's hand, feeling the faint warmth of his body, and stood still beside him, as if to make sure he was still alive. Carter watched the scene, feeling a surge of emotion in his heart. He knelt down next to Kaiser, stroking the dog's sandy fur, and feeling its trembling body under his hand. He knew that without Kaiser, they would never have found Ethan in time. He thought to himself, "You did the unthinkable, Kaiser." Aisha, standing next to Carter, wiped the dust from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Kaiser, saw his emaciated body, his trembling legs, and his bleeding claws, and she knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Ethan. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Kaiser. You are a true hero." The rescue team quickly gave Ethan first aid on the spot. David gave him fluids through and for, pumping cool saline solution to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken left leg and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left leg to stabilize it, and wrapped another layer of thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the intense heat. Ethan was still unconscious, but his breathing was gradually steadier, and his pulse was more noticeable thanks to the saline solution. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Ethan into an armored vehicle for transport back to base, Kaiser struggled to his feet to follow. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the dry sand. It had no strength to walk fast, but it tried, as if it didn't want to leave Ethan's side for even a second. Aisha looked at Kaiser, feeling a pang in her heart. She pulled an old coat from her pack, a sand-colored army jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and wrapped it around Kaiser to protect him from the heat. She stroked his head, feeling the sandy fur beneath her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. She knew Kaiser needed medical attention, but she also knew that he wouldn't leave Ethan's side until he was sure he was safe. Carter ordered the team, "Put Kaiser in the armored car next to Ethan. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." David and another member of the rescue team, Private First Class Miguel Lopez, a short, stocky man with short black hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Kaiser up, placing him in the armored car next to Ethan's stretcher. Kaiser didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Aisha's coat tighter around Kaiser's body and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the dust and heat from the car door. Kaiser lay close to Ethan, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes watching him with determination. He didn't have the strength to bark or move, but he was there, next to Ethan, as if to make sure he was safe. Ethan, though he was still unconscious, had a vague feeling creeping into his mind. He didn't know that the rescue team had found him, that Kaiser had been standing guard for 3 days, leading them here. But in his hazy dream, he saw Kaiser, his eyes shining, standing in the middle of the burning desert sand, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew that the dog would never abandon him. That miraculous moment, when Ethan was pulled from the pit, alive after 3 days trapped in the desert heat, was not only a miracle of survival, but also a testament to Kaiser's unwavering loyalty, the German shepherd who refused to abandon his companion. As the rescue team from the small military base in Kandahar pulled Ethan Brooks from the deep hole in the narrow alley of the abandoned village, the scorching desert heat still hung over everything on the July afternoon. The temperature hovered around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and dry winds blew, carrying fine dust that clung to the rescue team's faces and hands, blurring vision in the stifling air. Ethan lay unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips cracked from dehydration, and his weak breaths coming in thin wisps that dissipated in the dry air. The rescue team quickly wrapped him in a heat-resistant blanket, administered fluids through and for to combat dehydration, and immobilized his broken left leg with a makeshift brace made of hard plastic and medical tape. But as they worked, Kaiser, the German shepherd who had stood guard at the edge of the hole for 3 days, plodded closer, never leaving Ethan's side. Kaiser was now a shadow of his former self. His thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed to protect against the desert dust, was caked with fine sand and matted in dry, hard clumps, revealing a thin, shivering body beneath. Kaiser's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red from the dust, the heat, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches from 3 days of non-stop scratching at the dry sand, leaving small red streaks on the hot ground. Kaiser had no strength left to walk fast, but he trudged closer to Ethan's stretcher, bending down to sniff his face, as if to make sure he was still alive. As the rescue team laid Ethan down to bandage him and prepare him for loading into the armored vehicle, Kaiser lay close to the stretcher, using his body to shield Ethan from the sandstorm that blew through the alley. The rescue team looked at Kaiser with awe and emotion. Sergeant John Carter, the team leader, stood nearby, watching the dog with awe in his piercing blue eyes. Carter, a 35-year-old man with sun-bleached blonde hair and a tanned, angular face, had seen a lot in his military career, from surprise ambushes to inevitable loss in Afghanistan. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Kaiser lying next to Ethan, using his thin body to shield him, made him feel a pang of pain. He looked at the dog's trembling body, saw the sandy fur and dried blood on its claws, and knew that Kaiser had sacrificed everything to save Ethan. No food, no water, no rest for 3 days amid the scorching heat and the danger from the insurgents. He knelt beside Kaiser, stroked his sandy fur, felt the thin, trembling body beneath his hands. "You did what none of us could," he thought. "You are a true warrior." Corporal Aisha Khan, a member of the rescue team, stood next to Carter, looking at Kaiser with tears in her eyes. Aisha, a petite but agile 29-year-old with black hair tied back and tanned skin, had patrolled with Ethan and Kaiser on many missions in Kandahar. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a deep emotion when she saw Kaiser lying close to Ethan, shielding him from the dry, sandy winds with her body. She knelt down next to Kaiser, took an old coat from her pack, a sand-colored military jacket, frayed at the cuffs and soaked with sweat from days of patrol, and wrapped it around the dog to protect him from the heat and dust. She stroked Kaiser's head, feeling the sandy fur beneath her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. She whispered to herself, "You did everything to save him, Kaiser. Now it's our turn to take care of you." While the rescue team bandaged Ethan, Kaiser did not move from his position. The dog lay close to the stretcher, his body pressed tightly against the edge of the stretcher, like a living wall separating Ethan from the sandstorm blowing through the alley. Kaiser's legs trembled. The strong muscles that had once made him run like the wind on the dusty roads around the base now shrunk from the heat and lack of water. He no longer had the strength to stand, but he still tried, using his last bit of strength to protect Ethan. The rescue team saw this action, and a feeling of admiration welled up in their hearts. David, the team's medical officer, a man of about 35 years old with short brown hair and strong hands, was bandaging Ethan's left leg and looked up at Kaiser. He shook his head in amazement, thinking to himself, "I've never seen a dog like this." Not only did he save him, but he protected him to the very end. Ethan, still unconscious, did not know that Kaiser was beside him, protecting him from the heat and dust of the desert. He did not feel the faint warmth of Kaiser's emaciated body, did not hear the dog's panting as it struggled to keep its position. But in his hazy dream, he saw Kaiser, his eyes shining, standing in the middle of the burning desert sand, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew that the dog would never abandon him. In his heart, though he could not consciously realize it, a warm feeling crept into his mind, as if he knew he was not alone. The rescue team finished bandaging Ethan, securing his left leg with a makeshift splint made of hard plastic and medical tape, and wrapping a heat-resistant blanket around his body to protect him from the intense heat. They checked his breathing and pulse, finding them slightly more stable thanks to the cool saline solution being administered intravenously. But they knew Ethan needed to be taken back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care and then transferred to a larger military hospital. They loaded Ethan into an armored Humvee, a vehicle designed for rough desert terrain, with thick steel armor and large tires to handle sand dunes and dry dirt roads. The vehicle was covered with a sand-colored tarp to protect it from dust and heat, and Ethan was placed on a soft mattress to minimize vibrations during the ride. As the rescue team prepared to leave, Kaiser struggled to get up and follow Ethan. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, claws leaving small trails of blood in the dry sand. He had no strength left to walk fast, but he still tried, as if he didn't want to leave Ethan's side for even a second. Aisha looked at Kaiser, feeling a pang of pain in her heart. She knew the dog needed immediate medical attention, but she also knew that he wouldn't leave Ethan until he was safe. She knelt down next to Kaiser, stroked his head, and said to Carter, "We need to take Kaiser with us. He can't stay here." Carter nodded, ordering the team, Put Kaiser in the armored car next to Ethan. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both. David and Miguel Lopez, a short, stocky man with short black hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Kaiser and placed him in the armored car next to Ethan's stretcher. Kaiser didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Aisha's coat tighter around Kaiser's body and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the dust and heat from the car door. Kaiser lay close to Ethan, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes looking at him with determination. It had no strength left to bark or move, but was still there, next to Ethan, as if to make sure he was safe. The rescue team set off, the armored vehicle moving over dry dirt roads, heading for the base 15 kilometers away, where a medical team was waiting to receive Ethan and Kaiser. The sandstorm continued to blow, carrying fine dust that clung to the canvas of the vehicle, but inside, Kaiser lay close to Ethan, his thin body radiating a faint warmth. Carter sat in the front, looking back at Kaiser and Ethan, feeling a surge of emotion. He knew that Kaiser's protective actions were more than instinct. They were loyalty beyond all bounds, a deep friendship between a dog and its owner. He thought to himself, if he's alive, it's because of you, Kaiser. Aisha sat next to Kaiser, stroking his head, feeling his weak breathing under her hand. She looked at Ethan, saw his pale face slowly regaining some color from the saline solution, and she hoped that he would wake up. She looked at Kaiser, saw his red eyes still on Ethan, and knew he had done all he could. Thank you, Kaiser, she whispered to herself. You saved him, and we will save you. As the armored vehicle moved through the burning desert, Kaiser lay there, next to Ethan, a living testament to loyalty and friendship that had endured the test of heat, dust, and danger. After being pulled from a deep pit in a narrow alley in an abandoned village in Afghanistan's Kandahar province by rescuers, Ethan Brooks and Kaiser were loaded into an armored Humvee and driven to a small military base 15 kilometers away. The scorching desert heat was still in the air, with temperatures hovering around 45 degrees Celsius, and dry sandy winds blew through, carrying fine dust that clung to the sand-colored canvas of the vehicle. Ethan lay unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips dry and cracked, and his broken left leg temporarily immobilized with a plastic pad. N4 was hooked up to his arm, dripping cool saline solution to counteract the severe dehydration. Kaiser lay next to the stretcher, his thin body trembling, his black-brown fur matted with sand, his red eyes staring at Ethan with determination. The rescue team, led by Sergeant John Carter, sat around them, eyes a mixture of worry and hope as the vehicle rolled down the dry dirt roads toward the base. The journey to the base took about 30 minutes, and when the armored vehicle stopped in the base yard, a large area surrounded by high earthen walls and sandbags, a medical team was already waiting. Ethan was rushed into the base's medical shed, a small tin-roofed room with mud walls and a few medical beds, a medicine cabinet, and an old, whirring air conditioner to alleviate the heat outside. Nurses in sand-colored uniforms began to assess his condition, diagnosing him with severe dehydration, a broken left leg, and a deep laceration on his forehead. His skin was pale, his breathing was shallow, and his body was shaking despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. They gave him more saline intravenously, put him under a fan to cool him down, and took x-rays with a handheld machine to determine the extent of the damage to his leg. The doctors at the base decided that he needed to be transported to a larger military hospital for treatment, and a U-860 Black Hawk helicopter was called in to take him to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Kaiser, meanwhile, was taken to a separate area on the base reserved for working animals. A veterinarian named Hans, a man in his 40s with light blonde hair and pale blue eyes, checked on the dog. Kaiser weighed about 60 pounds, down nearly 11 pounds from his pre-explosion weight, having not eaten or drunk anything for 3 days in the desert heat. His black-brown fur was caked with sand, his eyes were red, and his claws were bleeding from deep scratches. Hans checked Kaiser's heart and breathing, which were weak but steady, and confirmed that the dog was severely weakened by hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. He gave Kaiser 4 fluids, pumped nutrient solution to replenish his energy, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool shed. He bandaged the scratches on Kaiser's claws and gently trimmed away the matted fur to clean his body. But Hans noticed that Kaiser's eyes kept darting toward the medical shed, as if searching for Ethan. The flight from Kandahar to Ramstein Air Base lasted over 6 hours. Ethan was placed on a medical stretcher in the helicopter's cabin, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with a small oxygen tube attached to his nose to aid his breathing. Kaiser was placed next to him in a metal transport cage, his emaciated body lying on a soft mattress, his red eyes peering through the metal bars to watch Ethan. The helicopter lifted off into the red sunset of the desert, the roar of the engines drowning out all other sounds, and as they flew over the mountains and plains, the heat of Kandahar gave way to the cooler air of the sky. When the helicopter landed at Ramstein Air Base early the next morning, the temperature in Germany was only about 18 degrees Celsius, a sharp change from the parched desert Ethan and Kaiser had just left. At the military hospital in Ramstein, Ethan was admitted to the intensive care unit. He was placed on a medical bed with a metal railing, in a small room with white walls, frosted glass windows overlooking the airport, and modern medical equipment such as a heart monitor and a backup ventilator. Doctors diagnosed him with severe dehydration, a broken left femur, and a laceration on his forehead that required stitches. They performed minor surgery to fix the femur with a metal rod and splint, and stitched the laceration on his forehead with 12 medical stitches. An oxygen tube was placed in his nose, and an IV drip hung from a metal rack next to the bed, providing nutrients and pain medication. For the first 3 days, Ethan remained in a coma, his body so weak that doctors feared the damage from dehydration might affect his brain, but they hoped he would wake up as his body recovered. Kaiser was cared for in an animal ward in the hospital, about 100 meters from Ethan's room. Hans, a veterinarian from Kandahar, flew in to continue monitoring the dog's condition. Kaiser was placed on a soft cushion examination table in a small room with white walls and a clean tile floor. Hans gave Kaiser 4 fluids, feeding him small meals of soft, protein-rich food like ground chicken mixed with rice to help him regain his strength. He cleaned Kaiser's sandy coat with warm water and mild soap, bandaged the scratches on his claws, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool German air. Kaiser gradually recovered, his body stopped shaking, and his red eyes began to shine brighter, but his gaze kept looking toward the door, as if waiting for Ethan. On the 3rd day in the hospital, Ethan began to show signs of waking up. He opened his eyes slowly, the white light from the ceiling shining into his eyes, causing him to blink repeatedly to adjust. He felt a dull ache in his left leg and forehead, but the pain was not as intense as before. He looked around, seeing the white walls, the medical bed, and the 4 hanging beside it. He couldn't remember clearly what had happened, only the blurry images of the explosion, the stifling heat in the pit, and the Kaiser's eyes in his mind. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak, and a young nurse named Anna, a girl of about 24 with brown hair tied back and soft blue eyes, quickly came over, placing her hand on his shoulder to hold him down. She told him in a gentle voice that he was saved, that he was in a hospital in Germany, and that he needed to rest. Ethan didn't say anything, but in his mind a single question appeared: where is Kaiser? When Ethan woke up, the rescue team informed Hans, and he decided to take Kaiser to his room. Kaiser, though still weak, had regained some of his strength under Hans' care. His fur had been cleaned, the scratches on his claws had been bandaged, and his thin body was no longer trembling. Hans led Kaiser on a leash through the long corridors of the hospital, with its white-tiled floors and the smell of antiseptic in the air, to Ethan's room. When the door opened, Kaiser saw Ethan lying on the bed, and his brown eyes lit up weakly but hopefully. The dog trudged over to the bed, pulling the leash in Hans's hand, and placed his head on Ethan's. Ethan looked down, saw Kaiser, and felt a surge of emotion. He reached out to stroke Kaiser's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and whispered to himself, "You saved me, Kaiser. Thank you." From then on, Kaiser stayed by Ethan's side throughout his stay in the hospital. The nurses set up a small mat in the corner of the room for Kaiser, and the dog lay there, never leaving Ethan's side. Hans came to check on Kaiser every day, feeding him small meals and changing bandages on his claws. Kaiser gradually regained his strength, his fur began to shine again, and his skinny body began to fill out. But his eyes never left Ethan. Whenever a stranger entered the room, Kaiser stood up, ears perked up, as if to protect him. Ethan, meanwhile, recovered slowly. He underwent physical therapy to regain strength in his left leg, and although the wound on his forehead had healed, he still felt a dull ache when he moved. He was still weak, but every day he felt better, and he knew that he was alive because of Kaiser. During his days in the hospital, Ethan thought about what had happened. He remembered the explosion, the stifling heat in the hut, and the despair he felt when he thought he would never get out. He remembered the hazy dreams of Kaiser, the dog's bright eyes, and the burning desert sand. He didn't know exactly what Kaiser had done to save him, but he felt the dog's loyalty in every moment. He looked at Kaiser, saw the dog lying on the rug in the corner of the room, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He whispered to himself, I owe you my life, Kaiser. I will never forget that. The story of Ethan and Kaiser spread through the military hospital in Ramstein and then through their unit in Kandahar. The nurses said that Kaiser never left Ethan's side, that the dog stood up whenever a stranger entered the room, as if to protect him. Doctors said Ethan's survival was a miracle, that he had overcome the limits of the human body thanks to Kaiser's will and loyalty. Carter, Aisha, and other members of the rescue team visited Ethan when they were transferred to Germany to report, bringing congratulations and admiration. They told him about Kaiser's loyalty, how the dog had stood guard at the edge of the pit for 3 days, leading them to him to save him. Ethan listened, his eyes filling with tears, and he stroked Kaiser's head, feeling the warmth of his body under his hand. After 4 weeks in the hospital, Ethan was discharged. He still needed crutches to get around because his left leg was not fully healed, but he was well enough to leave Germany. Kaiser, now stronger, walked beside him, his black-brown fur shiny, his ears erect, and his eyes as bright as ever. He left the hospital with a deep sense of gratitude, not only for being alive, but also for having Kaiser by his side, the companion who had not abandoned him in his most dangerous hour. He knew that his journey to recovery was not just physical, but also spiritual, and Kaiser had helped him find meaning in life again. After 4 weeks of treatment at the military hospital at Ramstein Air Base, Germany, Ethan Brooks was discharged on an early fall morning in 2023. The air in Ramstein was cool, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze carried the scent of dry leaves from the trees outside the hospital across the military airfield. Ethan walked out of the hospital building, leaning on a crutch in his right arm, his left leg still weak from surgery to stabilize his femur. He wore a new olive green military jacket that Aisha Khan had given him, a thick gray sweater and black jeans. His face was still pale, with a faint scar on his forehead from a healed laceration, but his brown eyes were brighter, shining with a determination and gratitude he had never known before. Beside him, Kaiser walked slowly, his black-brown fur restored from the days of care at the hospital. The 75-pound German Shepherd is now a healthy, erect dog with erect ears and bright brown eyes that sparkle with intelligence and loyalty. Kaiser stays by Ethan's side, never leaving his side, as if knowing that his mission to protect him is not over. Ethan decided not to return to Afghanistan or continue his military career. After the tragedy in Kandahar, he realized that his life needed a new direction, one that was not only for himself, but also for Kaiser, a companion who saved his life. He applied for early retirement from the military, citing his health as no longer fit for active duty, and was granted it after doctors confirmed that his left leg injury, although partially healed, would leave him permanently disabled, preventing him from patrolling or performing physically demanding tasks. He has no regrets. The military had given him a purpose over the years, but Kaiser had given him a reason to live. He packed his belongings from the base in Kandahar, which his comrades had sent to Germany after the incident, including his father's old duffel bag, a small folding knife, and the small notebook he used to jot down his scattered thoughts, and headed back to Lubbock, Texas, where his mother, Margaret, was waiting. The journey from Ramstein to Lubbock took more than 20 hours, including a commercial flight from Germany to Dallas, and then a drive home. Ethan and Kaiser flew on a Boeing 747, with Ethan in a window seat and Kaiser in a special cage in the cargo hold, tended to by airline staff for safety. When the plane landed at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport in the afternoon, the warm Texas air, around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, welcomed them, a welcome change from the cool of Germany, but still reminiscent of the scorching heat of Kandahar. Ethan rented a dark green Ford pickup at the airport, put Kaiser in the passenger seat, and drove to Lubbock, more than 300 miles away. Kaiser sat still, his head resting on the seat, his eyes half closed but alert to any sounds outside. Ethan stopped several times along the way at small gas stations, buying sandwiches and water for himself, and taking some dry food from his bag for Kaiser. At each stop, Kaiser got out of the car and walked beside him, ears pricked as if to make sure he was safe. When Ethan reached Lubbock, he drove along familiar red dirt roads, past white cotton fields stretching out in the afternoon sun. He stopped in front of the family's old prefab house, where his mother, Margaret, stood on the porch, wearing a gray sweater and a beige scarf. Margaret, now 58, with white hair and brown eyes like Ethan's, stepped out to greet him, her hands shaking with excitement. She held Ethan tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face as she saw him alive, though his body was still weak and on crutches. She didn't know much about what had happened in Kandahar, only that he had been in danger and saved. When she saw Kaiser step out of the car and walk beside Ethan, she knelt down and stroked his head, feeling the soft fur under her hand. "Thank you for bringing my son back," she whispered to herself. Ethan decided to use his military savings to buy a small house about 2 miles from his mother's house, on the edge of Lubbock. The house was a one-story wooden house with a brown shingle roof and a large backyard where Kaiser could run around. He fixed it up with the help of his brother Caleb, who drove from Oklahoma to visit him after hearing about the incident. Caleb, a tall, dark-haired 30-year-old with a stoop, didn't say much, but he spent his days helping Ethan paint the walls white, fix the leaky roof, and build a low wooden fence around the yard. Ethan and Kaiser moved into their new house in late fall, when the cotton fields around Lubbock were starting to be harvested, and the afternoon sunlight filtered through the cotton plants, brightening their small yard. Ethan and Kaiser took walks along the dirt roads around Lubbock every afternoon. Ethan needed crutches for the first few months, but he gradually abandoned them as his left leg healed through physical therapy at a small clinic in town. He walked slowly, taking in the crisp autumn air, the scent of dry earth and hay filling his nostrils. Kaiser walked beside him, ears perked, eyes bright, occasionally darting a few steps ahead to sniff the grass along the road or chase a small bird that flew by. Ethan looked at Kaiser, feeling a peace he had never known before. He thought about his days in Kandahar, about the patrols in the scorching heat, about the explosion that had almost taken his life, and how Kaiser had stood guard at the edge of the pit for 3 days to save him. He knew he would never forget Kaiser's loyalty, and he decided to spend the rest of his life caring for the dog, a friend who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. The story of Ethan and Kaiser spread through the local community in Lubbock and Ethan's old army unit in Kandahar. Lubbock neighbors who had known Ethan since he was a child came to visit him, bringing gifts like baked goods and homemade honey. They sat in his yard, listening to him tell the story of Kaiser and the loyalty of the dog that saved his life. They watched Kaiser, now healthy and happy, run around a yard and felt a deep sense of. In Kandahar, Sergeant John Carter, Corporal Aisha Khan, and other members of the rescue team told the story to new soldiers, making Ethan and Kaiser symbols of loyalty and camaraderie in the unit. Carter even offered Kaiser a military medal, but Ethan declined in a brief letter from Texas, saying that Kaiser didn't need a medal, he just needed him. Kaiser, now 4 years old, lives happily with Ethan in their small house in Lubbock. The dog no longer has to face the scorching heat of the desert or the dangers of landmines and insurgents. Instead, he lives a peaceful life, running around a yard, lying on the porch while Ethan reads on an old wooden chair, and walking with him on the red dirt roads. Ethan cares for Kaiser with all his love and gratitude, feeding him nutritious meals like ground beef mixed with rice, taking him to the veterinarian in Lubbock regularly, and petting his head every night before bed. He looks at Kaiser, sees the light in his eyes, and feels that he has found the true meaning of life not in military missions or months of running away from Lubbock, but in the deep friendship with Kaiser. For Ethan, the tragedy of Kandahar is not just a painful memory, but also a profound lesson. He learned that loyalty can transcend all boundaries, that the friendship between humans and animals is a bond that is strong and worthy of respect. He learned that perseverance can lead to hope, that Kaiser did not give up on him even when everything seemed hopeless. And he learned that four-legged friends like Kaiser deserve to be loved and cared for, not just because of what they do for us, but because they are a part of our lives. Every time Ethan looks at Kaiser, he whispers to himself, "Thank you, Kaiser. I will never forget what you have done for me." Ethan and Kaiser's story ends in peace and happiness, but the lesson from it remains forever. It is a lesson in Kaiser's absolute loyalty, when the dog did not give up on Ethan even in the face of heat, thirst, and danger. It's a lesson in enduring friendship, as Ethan and Kaiser's bond overcomes all odds to become a living testament to the bond between humans and animals. It's a lesson in perseverance leading to hope, as Kaiser stands guard for 3 days to lead the rescue team to Ethan's rescue. And it's a lesson in appreciating four-legged friends, as Kaiser not only saves Ethan's life, but also helps him find meaning in life. Ethan and Kaiser live together in a small house in Lubbock, a testament to friendship that transcends all boundaries, a story that four-legged loyalty will forever tell to honor loyal dogs like Kaiser.